A battleship is a large armored warship with a main battery consisting of large caliber guns. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the battleship was the most powerful type of warship, and a fleet of battleships was considered vital for any nation that desired to maintain command of the sea. The word battleship was coined around 1794 and is a contraction of the phrase line of battle ship, the dominant wooden warship during the Age of Sail. The term came into formal use in the late 1880s to describe a type of ironclad warship, now referred to by historians as PreDreadnought battleships. In 1906, the commissioning of HMS Dreadnought heralded a revolution in battleship design. Subsequent battleship designs, influenced by HMS Dreadnought, were referred to as dreadnoughts, though the term eventually became obsolete as they became the only type of battleship in common use. Battleships were a symbol of naval dominance and national might, and for decades the battleship was a major factor in both diplomacy and military strategy. A global arms race in battleship construction began in Europe in the 1890s and culminated at the decisive Battle of Tsushima in 1905, the outcome of which significantly influenced the design of HMS Dreadnought. The launch of Dreadnought in 1906 commenced a new naval arms race. 3 major fleet actions between steel battleships took place: the decisive battles of the Yellow Sea, 1904, and Tsushima, 1905, during the Russo-Japanese War, and the inconclusive Battle of Jutland, 1916, during the First World War. Jutland was the largest naval battle and the only full-scale clash of battleships in the war, and it was the last major battle fought primarily by battleships in world history. The naval treaties of the 1920s and 1930s limited the number of battleships, though technical innovation in battleship design continued. Both the Allied and Axis powers built battleships during World War II, though the increasing importance of the aircraft carrier meant that the battleship played a less important role than had been expected. The value of the battleship has been questioned, even during their heyday. There were few of the decisive fleet battles that battleship proponents expected, and used to justify the vast resources spent on building battle fleets. Even in spite of their huge firepower and protection, battleships were increasingly vulnerable to much smaller and relatively inexpensive weapons, initially the torpedo and the naval mine, and later aircraft and the guided missile. The growing range of naval engagements led to the aircraft carrier replacing the battleship as the leading capital ship during World War II, with the last battleship to be launched being HMS Vanguard in 1944. 4 battleships were retained by the United States Navy until the end of the Cold War for fire support purposes and were last used in combat during the Gulf War in 1991. The last battleships were stricken from the U.S. Naval Vessel Register in the 2000s. Ships of the line. A ship of the line was a large, unarmored wooden sailing ship which mounted a battery of up to 120 smoothbore guns and carronades. The ship of the line developed gradually over centuries and, apart from growing in size, it changed little between the adoption of line-of-battle tactics in the early 17th century and the end of the sailing battleship's heyday in the 1830s. From 1794, the alternative term line-of-battle ship was contracted, informally at first, to battleship or battleship. The sheer number of guns fired broadside meant a sail battleship could wreck any wooden enemy, holing her hull, knocking down masts, wrecking her rigging, and killing her crew. However, the effective range of the guns was as little as a few hundred yards, so the battle tactics of sailing ships depended in part on the wind. The first major change to the ship of the line concept was the introduction of steam power as an auxiliary propulsion system. Steam power was gradually introduced to the Navy in the first half of the 19th century, initially for small craft and later for frigates. The French Navy introduced steam to the line of battle with the 90-gun Napoleon in 1850, the first true steam battleship. Napoleon was armed as a conventional ship of the line, but her steam engines could give her a speed of 12 knots, 22 kilometers per hour, regardless of the wind condition. This was a potentially decisive advantage in a naval engagement. The introduction of steam accelerated the growth in size of battleships. France and the United Kingdom were the only countries to develop fleets of wooden steam screw battleships, although several other navies operated small numbers of screw battleships, including Russia, 9, the Ottoman Empire, 3, Sweden, 2, Naples, 1, Denmark, 1, and Austria, 1. Ironclads. The adoption of steam power was only one of a number of technological advances which revolutionized warship design in the 19th century. The ship of the line was overtaken by the ironclad, powered by steam, protected by metal armor, and armed with guns firing high explosive shells. Explosive shells. Guns that fired explosive or incendiary shells were a major threat to wooden ships, and these weapons quickly became widespread after the introduction of 8-inch shell guns as part of the standard armament of French and American line of battleships in 1841. In the Crimean War, 6 line of battleships and 2 frigates of the Russian Black Sea Fleet destroyed 7 Turkish frigates and 3 corvettes with explosive shells at the Battle of Sinop in 1853. Later in the war, French ironclad floating batteries used similar weapons against the defenses at the Battle of Kinban. Nevertheless, wooden-hulled ships stood up comparatively well to shells, as shown in the 1866 Battle of Lissa, where the modern Austrian steam two-decker SMS Kaiser ranged across a confused battlefield, rammed an Italian ironclad and took 80 hits from Italian ironclads, many of which were shells, but including at least one 300-pound shot at point-blank range. Despite losing her bowsprit and her foremast, and being set on fire, she was ready for action again the very next day. Iron armor and construction. The development of high explosive shells made the use of iron armor plate on warships necessary. In 1859 France launched Gulwar, the first ocean-going ironclad warship. She had the profile of a ship of the line, cut to one deck due to weight considerations. Although made of wood and reliant on sail for most journeys, Gulwar was fitted with a propeller, and her wooden hull was protected by a layer of thick iron armor. Gulwar prompted further innovation from the Royal Navy, anxious to prevent France from gaining a technological lead. The superior armored frigate Warrior followed Gulwar by only 14 months, and both nations embarked on a program of building new ironclads and converting existing screw ships of the line to armored frigates. Within 2 years, Italy, Austria, Spain, and Russia had all ordered ironclad warships, and by the time of the famous clash of the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia at the Battle of Hampton Roads, at least 8 navies possessed ironclad ships. Navies experimented with the positioning of guns, in turrets, like the USS Monitor, central batteries or barbettes, or with the ram as the principal weapon. As steam technology developed, masts were gradually removed from battleship designs. By the mid-1870s, steel was used as a construction material alongside iron and wood. The French Navy's Redoutable, laid down in 1873 and launched in 1876, was a central battery and barbette warship which became the first battleship in the world to use steel as the principal building material. PreDreadnought battleship. The term battleship was officially adopted by the Royal Navy in the reclassification of 1892. By the 1890s, there was an increasing similarity between battleship designs, and the type that later became known as the PreDreadnought battleship emerged. These were heavily armored ships, mounting a mixed battery of guns in turrets, and without sails. The typical first-class battleship of the PreDreadnought era displaced 15,000 to 17,000 tons, had a speed of 16 knots, 30 km per hour, and an armament of 4 12-inch, 305 mm, guns in 2 turrets fore and aft with a mixed-caliber secondary battery amidships around the superstructure. An early design with superficial similarity to the PreDreadnought is the British Devastation class of 1871. The slow-firing 12-inch, 305 mm, main guns were the principal weapons for battleship-to-battleship combat. The intermediate and secondary batteries had 2 roles. Against major ships, it was thought a hail of fire from quick-firing secondary weapons could distract enemy gun crews by inflicting damage to the superstructure, and they would be more effective against smaller ships such as cruisers. Smaller guns, 12-pounders and smaller, were reserved for protecting the battleship against the threat of torpedo attack from destroyers and torpedo boats. The beginning of the pre-Dreadnought era coincided with Britain reasserting her naval dominance. For many years previously, Britain had taken naval supremacy for granted. Expensive naval projects were criticized by political leaders of all inclinations. However, in 1888 a war scare with France and the build-up of the Russian Navy gave added impetus to naval construction, and the British Naval Defence Act of 1889 laid down a new fleet including 8 new battleships. The principle that Britain's navy should be more powerful than the 2 next most powerful fleets combined was established. This policy was designed to deter France and Russia from building more battleships, but both nations nevertheless expanded their fleets with more and better pre-dreadnoughts in the 1890s. In the last years of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th, the escalation in the building of battleships became an arms race between Britain and Germany. The German naval laws of 1890 and 1898 authorized a fleet of 38 battleships, a vital threat to the balance of naval power. Britain answered with further shipbuilding, but by the end of the pre-Dreadnought era, British supremacy at sea had markedly weakened. In 1883, the United Kingdom had 38 battleships, twice as many as France and almost as many as the rest of the world put together. By 1897, Britain's lead was far smaller due to competition from France, Germany, and Russia, as well as the development of pre-Dreadnought fleets in Italy, the United States and Japan. The Ottoman Empire, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Chile, and Brazil all had second-rate fleets led by armored cruisers, coastal defense ships or monitors. Pre-dreadnoughts continued the technical innovations of the ironclad. Turrets, armor plate, and steam engines were all improved over the years, and torpedo tubes were introduced. A small number of designs, including the American Kearsarge and Virginia classes, experimented with all or part of the 8-inch intermediate battery superimposed over the 12-inch primary. Results were poor. Recoil factors and blast effects resulted in the 8-inch battery being completely unusable, and the inability to train the primary and intermediate armaments on different targets led to significant tactical limitations. Even though such innovative designs saved weight, a key reason for their inception, they proved too cumbersome in practice. Dreadnought Era. In 1906, the British Royal Navy launched the revolutionary HMS Dreadnought. Created as a result of pressure from Admiral Sir John, Jackie, Fisher, HMS Dreadnought made existing battleships obsolete. Combining an all-big gun armament of 10 12-inch, 305 mm, guns with unprecedented speed, from steam turbine engines, and protection, she prompted navies worldwide to re-evaluate their battleship building programs. While the Japanese had laid down an all-big gun battleship, Satsuma, in 1904 and the concept of an all-big gun ship had been in circulation for several years, it had yet to be validated in combat. Dreadnought sparked a new arms race, principally between Britain and Germany but reflected worldwide, as the new class of warships became a crucial element of national power. Technical development continued rapidly through the Dreadnought era, with steep changes in armament, armor, and propulsion. 10 years after Dreadnought's commissioning, much more powerful ships, the super dreadnoughts, were being built. Origin. In the first years of the 20th century, several navies worldwide experimented with the idea of a new type of battleship with a uniform armament of very heavy guns. Admiral Vittorio Cuniberti, the Italian Navy's chief naval architect, articulated the concept of an all-big gun battleship in 1903. When the Regia Marina did not pursue his ideas, Cuniberti wrote an article in Jane's proposing an ideal future British battleship, a large armoured warship of 17,000 tons, armed solely with a single-caliber main battery, 12 12-inch guns, carrying 300 mm, 12-in, belt armour, and capable of 24 knots, 44 km per hour. The Russo-Japanese War provided operational experience to validate the all-big gun concept. At the Yellow Sea and Tsushima, PreDreadnoughts exchanged volleys at ranges of 7,600 to 12,000 yd, 7 to 11 kilometers, beyond the range of the secondary batteries. It is often held that these engagements demonstrated the importance of the 12-inch, 305 mm, gun over its smaller counterparts, though some historians take the view that secondary batteries were just as important as the larger weapons. In Japan, the two battleships of the 1903-04 program were the first to be laid down as all big gun designs, with 8 12-inch guns. However, the design had armor which was considered too thin, demanding a substantial redesign. The financial pressures of the Russo-Japanese War and the short supply of 12-inch guns which had to be imported from Britain meant these ships were completed with a mixed 10 and 12-inch armament. The 1903-04 design also retained traditional triple expansion steam engines. As early as 1904, Jackie Fisher had been convinced of the need for fast, powerful ships with an all-big gun armament. If Tsushima influenced his thinking, it was to persuade him of the need to standardize on 12-inch, 305 mm, guns. Fisher's concerns were submarines and destroyers equipped with torpedoes, then threatening to outrange battleship guns, making speed imperative for capital ships. Fisher's preferred option was his brainchild, the battle cruiser, lightly armored but heavily armed with 8 12-inch guns and propelled to 25 knots, 46 km per hour, by steam turbines. It was to prove this revolutionary technology that Dreadnought was designed in January 1905, laid down in October 1905 and sped to completion by 1906. She carried 10 12-inch guns, had an 11-inch armor belt, and was the first large ship powered by turbines. She mounted her guns in 5 turrets, 3 on the center line, 1 forward, 2 aft, and 2 on the wings, giving her at her launch twice the broadside of any other warship. She retained a number of 12-pound, 3-inch, 76 mm, quick-firing guns for use against destroyers and torpedo boats. Her armor was heavy enough for her to go head-to-head with any other ship in a gun battle, and conceivably win. Dreadnought was to have been followed by 3 Invincible-class battle cruisers, their construction delayed to allow lessons from Dreadnought to be used in their design. While Fisher may have intended Dreadnought to be the last Royal Navy battleship, the design was so successful he found little support for his plan to switch to a battlecruiser navy. Although there were some problems with the ship, the wing turrets had limited arcs of fire and strained the hull when firing a full broadside, and the top of the thickest armor belt lay below the water line at full load. The Royal Navy promptly commissioned another 6 ships to a similar design in the Bellerophon and St. Vincent classes. An American design, South Carolina, authorized in 1905 and laid down in December 1906, was another of the first dreadnoughts, but she and her sister, Michigan, were not launched until 1908. Both used triple expansion engines and had a superior layout of the main battery, dispensing with Dreadnought's wing turrets. They thus retained the same broadside, despite having 2 fewer guns. Arms race. In 1897, before the revolution in design brought about by HMS Dreadnought, the Royal Navy had 62 battleships in commission or building, a lead of 26 over France and 50 over Germany. In 1906, the Royal Navy owned the field with Dreadnought. The new class of ship prompted an arms race with major strategic consequences. Major naval powers raced to build their own dreadnoughts. Possession of modern battleships was not only seen as vital to naval power, but also, as with nuclear weapons after World War II, represented a nation's standing in the world. Germany, France, Japan, Italy, Austria, and the United States all began dreadnought programs, while Ottoman Turkey, Argentina, Russia, Brazil, and Chile commissioned dreadnoughts to be built in British and American yards. World War I. The battleship, particularly the dreadnought, was the dominant naval weapon of the World War I era. There were few serious challenges at that time. The most significant naval battles of World War I, such as Jutland, May 31, 1916 to June 1, 1916, were fought by battleships and their battlecruiser cousins. By virtue of geography, the Royal Navy was able to use her imposing battleship and battlecruiser fleet to impose a strict and successful naval blockade of Germany and kept Germany's smaller battleship fleet bottled up in the North Sea. Only narrow channels led to the Atlantic Ocean, and these were guarded by British forces. Both sides were aware that, because of the greater number of British dreadnoughts, a full fleet engagement would be likely to result in a British victory. The German strategy was therefore to try to provoke an engagement on their terms, either to induce a part of the Grand Fleet to enter battle alone, or to fight a pitched battle near the German coastline, where friendly minefields, torpedo boats, and submarines could be used to even the odds. Germany's submarines were able to break out and raid commerce, but even though they sank many merchant ships, they could not successfully blockade Great Britain, in contrast to Britain's successful battleship blockade of Germany, which was a major cause of Germany's economic collapse in 1918. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, successfully adopted convoy tactics to combat Germany's submarine blockade and eventually defeated it. The first 2 years of war saw the Royal Navy's battleships and battlecruisers regularly sweep the North Sea, making sure that no German ships could get in or out. Only a few German surface ships that were already at sea, such as the famous light cruiser SMS Emden, were able to raid commerce. Even some of those that did manage to get out were hunted down by battle cruisers, as in the Battle of the Falklands, December 7, 1914. The results of sweeping actions in the North Sea were battles such as the Heligoland Bight and Dogger Bank, and German raids on the English coast, all of which were attempts by the Germans to lure out portions of the Grand Fleet in an attempt to defeat the Royal Navy in detail. On May 31, 1916, a further attempt to draw British ships into battle on German terms resulted in a clash of the battle fleets in the Battle of Jutland. The German fleet withdrew to port after 2 short encounters with the British fleet. Less than 2 months later, the Germans once again attempted to draw portions of the Grand Fleet into battle. The resulting action of August 19, 1916 proved inconclusive. This reinforced German determination not to engage in a fleet-to-fleet battle. In the other naval theaters there were no decisive pitched battles. In the Black Sea, engagement between Russian and Ottoman battleships was restricted to skirmishes. In the Baltic Sea, action was largely limited to the raiding of convoys, and the laying of defensive minefields. The only significant clash of battleship squadrons there was the Battle of Moon Sound, at which one Russian PreDreadnought was lost. The Adriatic was in a sense the mirror of the North Sea. The Austro-Hungarian dreadnought fleet remained bottled up by the British and French blockade. And in the Mediterranean, the most important use of battleships was in support of the amphibious assault on Gallipoli. In September 1914, the threat posed to surface ships by German U-boats was confirmed by successful attacks on British cruisers, including the sinking of 3 British armoured cruisers by the German submarine SMU-9 in less than an hour. The British super-dreadnought HMS Audacia soon followed suit as she struck a mine laid by a German U-boat in October 1914 and sank. The threat that German U-boats posed to British dreadnoughts was enough to cause the Royal Navy to change their strategy and tactics in the North Sea to reduce the risk of U-boat attack. Further near misses from submarine attacks on battleships and casualties amongst cruisers led to growing concern in the Royal Navy about the vulnerability of battleships. As the war wore on, however, it turned out that whilst submarines did prove to be an incredibly dangerous threat to older pre-dreadnought battleships, as shown by examples such as the sinking of the Monsieur d'Y, which was caught in the Dardanelles by a British submarine, and the HMS Majestic and HMS Triumph were torpedoed by U-21, as well as HMS Formidable, HMS Cornwallis, HMS Britannia, etc., the threat posed to dreadnought battleships proved to have been largely a false alarm. HMS Audacious turned out to have been the only dreadnought sunk by a submarine in World War I. While battleships were never intended for anti-submarine warfare, there was one instance of a submarine being sunk by a dreadnought battleship. HMS Dreadnought rammed and sank the German U-29 on March 18, 1915 off Moray Firth. Whilst the escape of the German fleet from the superior British firepower at Jutland was effected by the German cruisers and destroyers successfully turning away the British battleships, the German attempt to rely on U-boat attacks on the British fleet failed. Torpedo boats did have some successes against battleships in World War I, as demonstrated by the sinking of the British PreDreadnought HMS Goliath by Muavinati Mili during the Dardanelles campaign and the destruction of the Austro-Hungarian dreadnought SMS St. Istvan by Italian motor torpedo boats in June 1918. In large fleet actions, however, destroyers and torpedo boats were usually unable to get close enough to the battleships to damage them. The only battleship sunk in a fleet action by either torpedo boats or destroyers was the obsolescent German PreDreadnought SMS Pommern. She was sunk by destroyers during the night phase of the Battle of Jutland. The German High Seas Fleet, for their part, were determined not to engage the British without the assistance of submarines, and since the submarines were needed more for raiding commercial traffic, the fleet stayed in port for much of the war. Interwar period. For many years, Germany simply had no battleships. The armistice with Germany required that most of the High Seas Fleet be disarmed and interned in a neutral port, largely because no neutral port could be found. The ships remained in British custody in Scapa Flow, Scotland. The Treaty of Versailles specified that the ships should be handed over to the British. Instead, most of them were scuttled by their German crews on June 21, 1919, just before the signature of the peace treaty. The treaty also limited the German navy, and prevented Germany from building or possessing any capital ships. The interwar period saw the battleship subjected to strict international limitations to prevent a costly arms race breaking out. While the victors were not limited by the Treaty of Versailles, many of the major naval powers were crippled after the war. Faced with the prospect of a naval arms race against the United Kingdom and Japan, which would in turn have led to a possible Pacific War, the United States was keen to conclude the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. This treaty limited the number and size of battleships that each major nation could possess, and required Britain to accept parity with the US and to abandon the British alliance with Japan. The Washington Treaty was followed by a series of other naval treaties, including the First Geneva Naval Conference, 1927, the First London Naval Treaty, 1930, the Second Geneva Naval Conference, 1932, and finally the Second London Naval Treaty, 1936, which all set limits on major warships. These treaties became effectively obsolete on September 1, 1939 at the beginning of World War II, but the ship classifications that had been agreed upon still apply. The treaty limitations meant that fewer new battleships were launched in 1919 to 1939 than in 1905 to 1914. The treaties also inhibited development by putting maximum limits on the weights of ships. Designs like the projected British N3 class battleship, the first American South Dakota class, and the Japanese Key class, all of which continued the trend to larger ships with bigger guns and thicker armor, never got off the drawing board. Those designs which were commissioned during this period were referred to as treaty battleships. Rise of air power. As early as 1914, the British Admiral Percy Scott predicted that battleships would soon be made irrelevant by aircraft. By the end of World War I, aircraft had successfully adopted the torpedo as a weapon. In 1921, the Italian general and air theorist Giulio Dauer had completed a hugely influential treatise on strategic bombing titled The Command of the Air, which foresaw the dominance of air power over naval units. In the 1920s, General Billy Mitchell of the United States Army Air Corps, believing that air forces had rendered navies around the world obsolete, testified in front of Congress that 1,000 bombardment airplanes can be built and operated for about the price of one battleship, and that a squadron of these bombers could sink a battleship, making for more efficient use of government funds. This infuriated the U.S. Navy, but Mitchell was nevertheless allowed to conduct a careful series of bombing tests alongside Navy and Marine bombers. In 1921, he bombed and sank numerous ships, including the unsinkable German World War I battleship SMS Ostfriesland and the American PreDreadnought Alabama. Although Mitchell had required wartime conditions, the ships sunk were obsolete, stationary, defenseless, and had no damage control. The sinking of Ostfriesland was accomplished by violating an agreement that would have allowed Navy engineers to examine the effects of various munitions. Mitchell's airmen disregarded the rules, and sank the ship within minutes in a coordinated attack. The stunt made headlines, and Mitchell declared, "No surface vessels can exist wherever air forces acting from land bases are able to attack them." While far from conclusive, Mitchell's test was significant because it put proponents of the battleship against naval aviation on the back foot. Rear Admiral William A. Moffett used public relations against Mitchell to make headway toward expansion of the U.S. Navy's nascent aircraft carrier program. Rearmament. The Royal Navy, United States Navy, and Imperial Japanese Navy extensively upgraded and modernized their World War I-era battleships during the 1930s. Among the new features were an increased tower height and stability for the optical rangefinder equipment, for gunnery control, more armor, especially around turrets, to protect against plunging fire and aerial bombing, and additional anti-aircraft weapons. Some British ships received a large block superstructure nicknamed the Queen Anne's Castle, such as in the Queen Elizabeth and Warspite, which would be used in the new conning towers of the King George V-class fast battleships. External bulges were added to improve both buoyancy to counteract weight increase and provide underwater protection against mines and torpedoes. The Japanese rebuilt all of their battleships, plus their battle cruisers, with distinctive pagoda structures, though the Hai received a more modern bridge tower that would influence the new Yamato class. Bulges were fitted, including steel tube arrays to improve both underwater and vertical protection along the water line. The U.S. experimented with cage masts and later tripod masts, though after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor some of the most severely damaged ships, such as West Virginia and California, were rebuilt with tower masts, for an appearance similar to their Iowa-class contemporaries. Radar, which was effective beyond visual range and effective in complete darkness or adverse weather, was introduced to supplement optical fire control. Even when war threatened again in the late 1930s, battleship construction did not regain the level of importance it had held in the years before World War I. The building holiday imposed by the naval treaties meant the capacity of dockyards worldwide had shrunk, and the strategic position had changed. In Germany, the ambitious Plan Z for naval rearmament was abandoned in favor of a strategy of submarine warfare supplemented by the use of battle cruisers and commerce raiding, in particular by Bismarck-class battleships. In Britain, the most pressing need was for air defenses and convoy escorts to safeguard the civilian population from bombing or starvation, and rearmament construction plans consisted of 5 ships of the Key.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.